think about VAT and grants? In other words, unearned payments that you receive. Your instinct or gut feel would probably be that surely there could be no VAT on this. Now, in today's episode of Tax Break, the podcast for South African tax professionals and practitioners, I look at a case that illustrates that you have to be very careful. This is more complex. This topic of grants is more complex than it would seem at first. Before I start, I would like to ask that if you like listening to the podcast, if you would mind rating it on your favorite podcast platform, so that gives the platform an indication of podcasts that are listened to and that they can recommend to other people. And that also, if you would be so kind to share it with another person who also works in South African tax, who may also be interested in becoming a regular listener. I've put my email address in the notes, so if there's any correspondence, ideas, suggestions, questions, or if you need some tax advice, please send me an email. Now, let's get back to grants, and I think to start off, I would like to look at some of the elements of the structure of the VAT Act that relates to grants or grant-type payments. So, first things first, if we look at Section 1, so of course Section 1 is the section of the VAT Act that contains all the definitions. There's a definition of a grant in Section 1, so that definition reads it's an appropriation, a grant in aid, a subsidy, or a contribution transferred, granted, or paid to a vendor by a public authority, a municipality, or a constitutional institution as listed in the first schedule to the PFMA. The definition doesn't stop there. It doesn't just say if you've got these types of payments by these types of entities, then it will definitely be a grant. It also has an exclusion, or a few exclusions, amongst others, for payments made for goods and services to the entity making the payment to the vendor. So there's a clear indication that if the payment is for goods and services, it can't be a grant. Now, this definition of a grant is then the relevance in the context of the VAT Act. It's linked to a deemed supply in Section 85A, which in turn links to a zero rating that would apply if you've got a grant paid to a person to assist a person in carrying on an enterprise. And the purpose of the zero rating is really to not affect the person's entitlement to input tax in respect of costs incurred in the course of the enterprise just because there's been a grant inflow. Now, it could well be that you've got these payments coming from places that or from persons that are not public authorities, municipalities, or constitutional entities, and in that case, you would have to arguably look at the concepts of supply, the concepts of goods and services, and the concept of consideration to guide you as to whether there should be a VAT on this payment or not. And I think the presence or the absence of goods and services is critical in making this determination. So let's now turn to the court case. And as I've said, this case illustrates some of the complexities that may be involved as soon as you start working with grants. So the case is the VAT 1543 case. It was heard in the Johannesburg Tax Court, and the judge was Judge Marley. Now, let's have a look at some of the key facts. The taxpayer is a non-profit company as well as a public benefit organization, so a PBO. It's also a welfare organization, so that adds a little bit more complexity from a VAT perspective because there are also some deemed supply rules and zero ratings specifically for welfare organizations. The taxpayer was incorporated in 2002 and it was established to research, develop and deliver capacity building programs in school management, leadership, school governance, teacher development for schools, including schools in the Gauteng province. And what the judgment also tells us is that the GDE, the Gauteng Department of Education, was a founding member of this taxpayer. So what then happened? The GDE paid grants to the taxpayer, and the taxpayer received these grants from the GDE, didn't account for VAT on them, and SARS contended that these were in fact not grants, they were considerations for actual supplies. SARS then went back for 9 years, so for the period 2006 to 2015. So I think the reality is that that's a long time to go back, and the case shows us that then if you've been doing it incorrectly for such a long time, your risk is quite significant. So the tax involved was 93 million rand, and the penalties was another 18 million. What the judgment doesn't tell us, especially and given the long period involved, I would guess that there was also a substantial amount of interest involved in or payable by the taxpayer. So you probably had a non-profit company sitting with a tax bill of, I would guess, well in excess of 150 million. So a few further important facts about that could then that the court considered in considering whether SARS's position was correct or not. There was a MOU concluded between the parties, and the MOU had a clause that basically stated that the taxpayer was appointed as the first option service provider in relation to the provision or the programs to improve the quality of education in schools through the transformation of education in the Gauteng province by improving school management and governance skills. So the difficult thing here is that the term service provider already creates the perception that maybe it's not just a payment for no consideration or for no performance. Process-wise, what's important here is that the taxpayer applied for grants, and the GDE was free. It had the discretion to award the grant or not. But very important, once the grant was awarded, it was paid via an invoice or paid for an invoice issued by the taxpayer. And this invoice had to comply with the procurement requirements of the department. So the court's discussion shows us that the core of the dispute was really, what's the nature of these payments? Were these payments gratuitous or unrequited transfers of funds? Or was there a quid pro quo where the taxpayer really rendered services to the department? The court's view was that the evidence clearly showed that there was a quid pro quo required. So as they described it, they viewed it as the department really paying the taxpayer to act as its training delivery arm and to perform these capacity building functions for the department. The court also said that the fact that the ultimate beneficiaries of the work or the activities of the taxpayer were the teachers and the learners who were basically within. So it was part of a function that the GDE had to do as to fulfill its public duties. That didn't alter the fact that the taxpayer was still a service provider to the department. So the court held that the department received direct and substantial value in return for these payments, and the language used in the agreement or the MOU made it clear that we were looking at a principal-agent relationship, not a benefactor-grant recipient type of relationship. So the court found that the taxpayer failed to discharge the burden of proving that these payments were not subject to VAT, and that the tax bill therefore stood. So what can you possibly take home from this? I think two things in my mind. The first one is, when it comes to grants, be careful. Be very, very careful. This is complex. If you want to see how complex it is, go and have a look at Interpretation Note 39 that SARS issued. It's a good resource. It goes through the history of how the legislation developed. And it is a resource that as soon as you start reading it, you'll see the complexity in these provisions. I think the second thing to take home is that if you want to go to the core of, are you looking at something that should have VAT or not, it really comes down to the question as to whether goods or services are being supplied or not. So those core concepts in the VAT Act, they are also relevant here. I want to remind you, as always, that nothing in this podcast is intended to be tax advice. The podcast is only for information purposes. That's that for today. So I will speak to you again next week. Goodbye.